All right, let's replace this mangled battery connector. So what we're going to do here is just very gently score the sticker in these two areas here, and this will make it easy to just kind of peel this off. You will see me struggle with it a little bit because getting underneath this takes some precision and patience. So I may speed up the video here in a few spots so you don't have to be tortured by watching, but what we want to do is expose all of the areas where this is soldered onto the logic board. If you apply some heat, you'll find that it comes off a little bit easier. Now we could just blast this thing with hot air, but for the sake of not putting any excess heat on the board, I do prefer to remove the factory solder or at least flow in some leaded solder so that the melting point comes down a bit. You'll find that this spot right over here and then one of the larger ones at the top are going to be a little tricky as far as heating them up to get the solder out. So just plenty of flux, mix in some lead, and make sure you've got your temperature right. It's going to vary depending on the number of different factors. I want to say with this one, I went at about 400 degrees Celsius. You can get some pretty decent airflow on here because there's not too much in the way on this side of the board as far as knocking things off. But again, use your judgment. You don't want to overheat the board. You just want to slowly warm these up until they start to liquefy. And as you can see here, what I'm doing is I've just gone over a few times with some flux and a solder braid and try to get as much of this residual solder out of here as we possibly can after we've mixed in the leaded solder. Right, so the good news here is this is not like a PS4 HDMI port. It's not like a USB-C where you have to worry about pins on the other side ripping off the board. Everything that you see here is what we're concerned with. So when these little holes liquefy and the port is ready to come off, you can pull it out and you're not really going to damage anything. You shouldn't have to pull super hard, but again, you don't have to worry about any pins on the other side getting stuck on the board. So just take your time and make sure that you don't spend too much time, if that makes sense. We want it to heat up, but we don't want to heat this thing up for 5 or 10 minutes straight, because then you can cause the radiant heat to potentially damage surrounding components. So again, if you haven't done this before, it's probably a good idea to practice beforehand. But you'll see here shortly that the solder is starting to liquefy and the port's wiggling around a bit. Again, on the left-hand side, you can see that was a little tricky to get that out. So right here is where you're gonna have to concentrate the heat a little bit more than other areas. And you'll see here when I go to evacuate the solder from these holes, it is again the hole on the furthest to the left and then the fourth from the left, that big oval shaped one that's a little tricky to get all the solder out of. In fact, I will switch to a larger tip momentarily because this one just doesn't get enough heat down in there to pull the solder out. All right, let's flow just a little more lead down inside here and make sure we get it to kind of saturate and mix with the non-leaded solder that's in here, because that stuff's tricky to get out. And again, we don't just want to rely on too much heat, because if you get it too hot, you have a whole new set of problems to worry about. So let's mix this in and then hopefully we can get it out. I have switched to a larger tip, but that one by itself still didn't do the trick. I had to mix the lead in, add a little more flux, make sure you have fresh flux all the time, of course. And then finally we can get this stuff to come out clean. All right, so I'm going to put just a bit more lead. This one's particularly stubborn for whatever reason. Little fresh flux and a fresh piece of wick so we don't have any other solder already in it, which is going to be counterproductive. All right, there we go. So we've got all of the solder out. We're just going to clean this up a bit. because we don't need a bunch of flux in this side. I would not worry about the opposite side of the board at this point. You're going to have to clean that up later. And in fact, a small amount of a small amount of flux on the opposite side will actually kind of hold the port in place. You'll see here as I lift this into position from the bottom, this is our replacement part. And when you set it in there, you may want to prop it up with something from beneath. So if you have a pair of tweezers that are fairly wide as far as how far open they are, you can kind of set them underneath here so the tension from your tweezers is pushing up from the bottom, if that makes sense, hopefully. Or you can get a clamp. This is a pair of self-closing tweezers, and I just clamp this onto the board to stabilize it. Now the interesting thing is, if I here in a minute, when I take the clamp off, you'll actually see that the port will hold itself in place, but of course we want to have a nice snug fit, so I'd recommend you probably keep either the tweezers on it or have something pushing up from the bottom so this thing doesn't go floating around. You don't want it to drop part of the way out. But from here, all we have to do really is fill up these holes with solder. Make sure you're not bridging anything. And again, you've got a nice big area to work with here, so it's not like you have to worry about the types of smaller details that you generally see on surface mounted components. This one's pretty big. You can possibly even do this without a microscope if you have better vision than I do. I can't attest to that. But the main thing here is to make sure these holes are filled in. We don't have any solder flowing out connecting one to the other, because obviously these are the majority of these need to be isolated from each other. All right, so that's looking pretty good from this side. If you want to add some heat, that'll make it easier to clean off the flux. So I'm going to speed up the video one more time here so we can get through this. And this is the end result. So do make sure that you get some Kapton or some other sort of insulation underneath here. We don't want these contacts grounding out on the housing for the tablet. And then there are two small contacts here. You want to make sure to go ahead and cover those up as well. I'm not too worried about any adhesive being covered because this thing has plenty to start with. That's really the main reason that these get messed up in the first place, is because there's so much adhesive under the board and people jam their pry tool or whatever they're using to isolate the battery underneath there. So you got to be very gentle with these, but as you can see now we have all of our contacts in position. Everything will interface with the board and we are done.
If you found the video helpful, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and check out our weekly Tech Talk live stream. Have a great one, and thanks for watching.